right. Thank you very much for having me for this introduction. So as you mentioned, my project I will talk about today was conducted last summer, so it's quite recent and we are still working on the analysis, so you will have the first results. I'm looking at insular husbandry practices, so that would be a relationship between people and animals, particularly in the Western Isles of Scotland, by looking at the Isle of Gunna. So I will talk a bit more in detail afterwards. So briefly about the presentation, so I will give a background about the site, I'll talk about the research project, and we have time for questions afterwards. So Gunna is just a really tiny island between Tarry and Cole in the Inner Hebrides. So that's 2 kilometers long and 0.4 kilometers wide. So the name of the island, Gunna, probably comes from the Norse, who were in the region from the 8th century, but there has been archaeological remains right from the prehistoric period. The site was probably abandoned around the early 19th century, and then it was used up to the 1990s as a place for grazing cattle and sheep. So the history of the project already started like in 1998, when there has been some excavation in advance of a house construction in Gunna. So you can see it's the red square here. So there has been some structures which the earliest would date from the 15th century. And then in 2016, an undergraduate student, Lindsay, started to sort the material, made a preliminary record. And then last year, we got some funding by Carnegie to get a really full record in the new database and do a proper analysis of the faunal remains. So the research project is for us really important and intriguing because there has been few studies which look at the faunal remains in this region of Scotland because of the limited number of archaeological sites excavated and the animal bones assemblage recovered. And also it has been noted that the interest in post-medieval assemblage, in particular faunal remains in Britain, is still limited and should have a higher place in a research agenda. So because Gunna is such a well-preserved assemblage, we would like to include it in a wider framework. So a bit about the materials we are using. So the Zooarchaeological material that I mentioned that directly come from the 1990s excavations. And what I wanted to do is to also look at historical sources. So I will mention here that the Zooarchaeological assemblage is could be quite small, so it's obviously a small island, so that's also not too surprising, but it's about 10 boxes from each context. But the really good thing with Gunna is that it's really well preserved, with about like 1/4 being complete or almost complete. And about the historical sources, so I looked at different types of historical accounts. So you have a personal account, so that would be from travelers just visiting the Western Isles and describing what they are seeing, how the people are living, but also some administrative accounts. So that would be for statistical accounts in the Hebrides. Then some historical maps, which is quite interesting to see how Gunna was actually looked at and described. And obviously some photographs as well. So for the methods of the research, we did the standard archaeological analysis. So that would be everything was recorded in the database. So each bone would be looked at, identified, then any modifications such as butchery marks or work bones would be also recorded, photographed, measured. And then for the historic sources, I wanted it to be also quite systematic. So that's why we came up with the idea of creating a database as well for the historical sources, where it would basically look like something like this. So each time I would find a mention of some husbandry practices, there would be the quotation. In turn, there would be the page, for instance, and everything was properly. And then we can kind of see a pattern. So that was quite interesting. And just to here, the map that you can see on the bottom right is actually the earliest mention of Gunna I could find. So that was from 1654. So before it would like either not be written or just like a tiny spot on the map. But this was the first time like Gunna was actually properly written. So I'll check a little bit. So now I will touch a bit upon the preliminary results we have. So as you can see here on the graph, cattle and sheep are the two main species that we have in the assemblage. And this actually echoes other archaeological sites, such as Odell North in Northwest. So then there is also some several wild species. So there would be birds and also fish. So there is kind of a big difference, and we will talk about, for example, the lack of fish remains as well, a bit more detail afterwards. What is quite interesting as well is that what we have in the zooarchaeological record is kind of also seen in the historical sources. So this is from 1549, and this is the earliest, again, the earliest written source I could find, directly talking about Gunna. And it says that it was a place cultivated, inhabited, and good for livestock and fishing, which is what also we can find in the archaeological record. So that was quite interesting to compare with that. Another important note is that we found that the cattle was quite small compared to the modern specimens, and this is again already confirmed in historical sources. And this was probably noticed most by the travelers who were visiting the place for the first time, and they were it was for them a bit striking. And this is possibly due to the fact that the breed was not improved in the Western as it was in the mainland. And this is also due, as you can see on the picture, because of the cattle who didn't have really good resources of good food during the winter, especially when they had to eat seaware, for instance. So I would like to check this hypothesis by applying some osteometrics in the future, by really comparing this data that we have with other sites as well in the region in the UK. So now if you go a bit, if you look closer at the cattle and sheep, the two main domesticates, so we can see on the left that the majority of remains from cattle are actually juvenile. And this is for us quite interesting, and probably might be because of the fact that cattle could be used as secondary products. So that would mean that half or like all the male cows would be slaughtered, just born, and only the female ones would be kept for then dairy products. And this is again something that is seen in other sites, especially in Northwest. What is also quite interesting, as you can see, is that all ages are represented, which gives the idea that they were born, so the cattle was born and raised on site, which kind of make us think that the settlement might be permanent rather than seasonal. And if we look also at sheep, so which is now on the right, this is quite a different pattern when actually the majority of sheep is slaughtered when sub-adult, which is a prime age for meat. So it would be maybe more that rather than wool, which is not really attested in historical sources. So that's what the first pattern we have right now. So if we look at birds now, so birds are about like 9% of the assemblage, and we have several cut marks on the bones, which would indicate that birds were actually consumed. So the majority of birds are actually seabirds, and this is also noticed in Northwest, when the seabirds are about 60% of the total assemblage. In Gunna, it is 78%. So you will see like here on the picture, so that would be gannet, shag, and guillemot. So obviously we need to bear in mind that the larger birds would be better or would survive better, archaeologically speaking, and that they have a higher chance of being recovered. And also birds in general are also more fragile. We could maybe think that the representation of birds is a bit lower than what it could actually be, but it's definitely seabirds, which is the majority in Ghana. So if we look at fish now, what is quite interesting is that we have different species represented, mainly flatfish, and that what were considered the greater fish, which was called pollock ling. And we have on the bottom right the anglerfish, which was like the most impressive remain, but is only the only one in Ghana. What I also wanted to talk about was what it can tell us about fishing practices. So the thing is, cod, pling, all these greater fish live at greater depth. So we could think that the people in Ghana would probably go further with boats, long lining, and probably when it's not so stormy in the summer months. But what is really interesting and not really the case sometimes in other sites is that there are a lot of flat fish, which would be smaller and living in closer to the bay, so inshore. And this is quite interesting because it requires less time, no much resources, it's less risky, it can be all year round. So we are actually thinking that maybe the people were using this, so Ghana as, you know, a place for all year round, some easier in a way, fishing, that's the more dangerous one offshore. Also one aspect is that the bones, the fish remains are not as much representative of the historical sources. So when you look at historical sources as the one up here, fishing looks really like a big activity at the time, but it is not really reflected in the archaeological data when domesticates are much more there. And this can be maybe interpreted by the fact that fish bones are more fragile, less dense. So we are thinking that probably historical sources mention an important activity, but because of the variability of survival in the archaeological remain, that could be also one aspect that we need to consider. So now we'll talk a bit about the modification, the cultural modification, in particular birchery marks. So there are quite a few in the assemblage, about 20%. So it's especially marks on cattle, sheep, pig, and seabirds, which would indicate consumption. Interestingly, there are no cut marks on horse bones, which kind of correlates with the late medieval accounts that horses were not usually eaten. And what we could also see are marks on seals, which would probably be for skin and oil, and as well as 2 little otters. So it could be also for fur. So we are kind of thinking in this direction. Finally, I wanted to talk about the work bones, which is kind of a nice, nice category in Ghana. So this is definitely the most impressive faunal remains that we have. So this is a whale vertebra, which is quite massive compared sometimes to the tiny bones. So this one is interestingly perforated. And when it was found in the archaeological excavation, it was possibly so it was said that it was possibly used as a door pivot, which is quite interesting in the way like how the people would reuse faunal remains for their for living. So it also has some cut marks. So interesting, we don't have much historical sources about whaling or like really hunting practices, especially in this region, but it is sure that whales were eaten. So it would often be the case, as you can see here on the right, when the whale would be close to the shore, or sometimes it would be easier anyway to have, and it would be a few of them. But it's definitely it says very nourishing meat. So it's possibly that this vertebra was also like this whale was eaten. So another nice category of work bones are these. So these are metapoles of sheep. What is quite intriguing is that there are 6 of them which are perforated longitudinally. So there would be like a clear cut through, and some are actually also polished. And this practice has already been observed in North Atlantic communities. So I could read reports which would state that these metaboles were also found in Iceland and Shetland, and probably originates from 1150 or 1200. And it's quite interesting that we found this in Gunna, which is a post-Mdieval site, and which is more like Western Isles. So it's kind of an interesting practice that seems to be also done in Gunna, could be for bone marrow extraction. And we have this one which is a bit like intriguing. This is the only one we have which has like kind of a curved cut, which looks like almost maybe decoration of use for another object. We don't really, we're a bit puzzled with this. So if you have any ideas what it could be, or if you have ever seen this, let us know, because so this is a tibia for cattle. So yeah, this is an interesting word bone, but we don't know yet. We don't know much about it yet. So to summarize a bit all this data, so we wanted to link zooarchaeological data with historical sources. And it seems when we compare all this that people in Gunna were rather low status and rather small, but definitely a farming community. The island could have been used for grazing and cultivation from the 15th to the early 19th century, when the site seems to have been abandoned. So people were definitely raising domesticates, so cattle and sheep. Cattle, we are thinking more for dairy products, while sheep more for meat. There were a few horses, probably for labor, and pigs are marginal in the assemblage, and in other sites it is also the case. So we think that it could be because of the fact that the site is not suitable for a pig, especially because of the absence of woodland and vegetation. So even though they are domesticated, there are also several wild species, in particular seabirds, and the practice of inshore and offshore fishing. So it seems that this practice was carried directly by the people and perhaps on a smaller scale. But again, we need to keep in mind the kind of taphonomic processes in archaeology. So, but what we can say for now is that people had, in a way, this dairy, meat, wild species. So it seems that it could be self-sufficient for diet, which is quite an interesting, discovery as well. So I think I talked about a bit everything, but let me know if you have any questions. So just before finishing, I wanted to acknowledge sort of people. So especially the Carnegie Trust, who funded this project last summer. Edward McLean, who is my supervisor. So I wanted to thank him for obviously all the training, the help for especially up to now. So I also wanted to thank Heather James, who was the archaeologist in Ghana and who helped us as well. And of course, Lindsay, who started the project in 2016, and Veronica Lee, who is looking at the birds, at the fish remains, sorry. So she's doing all the analysis and identification of fish, so which is also a big work. Thank you very much.